If you drive to Texas, don't do it at night. A week or so ago, I was driving down to Texas. It was a long drive, one that would take 2 days unless I drove nonstop throughout the night. However, I was eager to reach my destination, and I chose to tough it out for the sake of getting there sooner. The drive started out relatively normal. I drove for a couple of hours south, and I felt good. I had my music cranked and a cooler full of energy drinks in the passenger's seat. When I saw the sign saying, "Now entering Tennessee," I thought I was making record time. I must have forgotten to watch the clock, though, because the sun began to set. I was partially confused, mainly due to the fact that I had left earlier in the day, but I disregarded it as the idle distractions I'd created for myself to pass the time faster being the cause. Something else odd I noticed was the open freeway. Normally I would expect to see many vehicles all traveling to different places, but instead I seemed to be the only one out and about. Still, I wasn't feeling tired, and I had already committed to driving straight through the night, even if things seemed strange. But as I drove on, I realized that the sun had set far too quickly, and with the lack of vehicles on the road, it looked like I was driving in a void. The blackened world around me was only illuminated by my high beams, but I could only see perhaps 15 feet ahead of me. There were a few normalities like guardrails and mile markers, but if something were to appear in front of me, I'd likely hit it because of my lack of visibility. So I pulled over. My vehicle came to a subtle halt on the side of the freeway, and I turned on my emergency lights. Realistically, I knew it wasn't a fog. It was just darker than the world behind my eyelids. I suppose I wanted to see another car pass by before I concluded that something had gone wrong, but none came. I waited for more than 20 minutes, and not one car or truck barreled down the freeway. I decided to roll my window down and allow some fresh air into my car. Plus, I was slightly panicking because I did have somewhere to be, and this was taking up precious time. Suddenly, the engine shut off. Even the accessory power had gone cold. I performed some percussive maintenance by smacking my hand against the dash as if it would magically fix everything, but it obviously didn't. Then I heard a quiet ticking sound. You know the sound your fingers make when you tap them against a table. It was like that, but instead of the soft, fleshy contact you'd get from the skin of your digits, it was more like the clicking of nails against plastic. My intuition told me it was coming from under the hood, and therefore I'd have to step outside. But just as I was about to open the door, I almost had a heart attack because hanging over the trim of the window sill was a hand. I freaked out and flung myself into the passenger seat on top of my cooler. The hand was tapping its pale white fingers against the inner part of my door. After my initial fear died down, I thought that it may have been someone looking to help me. Foolish, I know, but I did have my ways on. A part of me knew full well that another vehicle hadn't pulled up behind mine while I was distracted by the engine malfunction. But I still inquired, "Hello, who's there?" The fingers stopped moving, and the hand slipped down slowly over the side of the door out of sight. I waited while trying to catch my breath before asking again, "Hey, who's there? Why are you messing with me?" No sound. Not even crickets responded to me. I turned my head to peer out of the rear window, and couldn't see anything, which made me wonder more as to who was outside of my car. My ear was pressed against the passenger window, and just as I was about to slide back into the driver's seat, I heard the tapping a second time right next to my ear. I nearly got whiplash from the speed at which I turned my head to look out of the window. There wasn't anything there in terms of a tapping hen, however. There were fingerprints left in the condensation on the outside of the glass. My heart raced and I crawled back into the driver's seat and tried to stupidly roll the window up, even though I quickly realized that was futile. Then I started to hear footsteps in the gravel on the side of the asphalt. But when I looked in my mirrors, I saw nothing. That was until my headlights came on without warning. They flashed brightly ahead of me and illuminated the figure of a human standing directly in the light. But I couldn't see who it was because they were missing their head. The headless torso held out its thumb as if it were hitchhiking. However, it only did so for a moment before beginning to approach my vehicle. I tried to start the engine, but for some reason my key wouldn't crack, and then I thought, if the headlights are on, then surely I should be able to at least roll the window up. It moved slowly, the body, that is, towards me with a shambling and stable gait. Unfortunately for me, my window wouldn't go up, even when fiddling with the key in the ignition. I started to panic, and sweat began forming on the palms of my hands. By the time it was at the front corner of the driver's side, I decided I would get out and confront it. As I reached for the door handle and pulled, I found that it wouldn't open. I have one of those stupid pull-up locks that sink into the door, so I wasn't able to grip it and force it up. The electronic unlock didn't work either, so my only option was to climb out of the window. The problem was, it had already reached my side mirror. There was no way I would be able to crawl through the window without the thing grabbing me. So once again I slid into the passenger seat with my feet poised to kick if it tried to worm its unnatural way inside. From there I could see it was a masculine body, but was exceedingly tall, and it wore a gray sweatshirt laden with holes. It had scuffed pants with tread marks denoting a tire had crossed over them at ludicrous speed. If I had to guess, I'd say they had been run over. As it tried to reach its arm inside, I kicked it away. It didn't appear to have much more than primal instinct because it stumbled back and took some time to regain itself. Still, regardless of the fact that it was a brainless walking corpse, I was still terrified. When it reached inside the second time, I scooted myself towards the driver's seat and forcibly jammed my foot against its chest, sending it falling to the ground. I used the opportunity to get out of the car via the open window and run around to the trunk. I couldn't open it without the key, which I had stupidly left inside, but at least I could get away. But as it rose to its feet, I felt an immense pressure in my head as if someone were squeezing my brain. My vision became blurry, and different parts of my body burned with a fiery intensity. Every time I tried to move one of my limbs, I couldn't, and the paralysis weaving its way throughout my body made me an easy target. The headless torso continued shuffling its disjointed feet in my direction with an outstretched hand, but the other was held low with its thumb out. Suddenly, my faculties snapped back into my control, and I was able to avoid its mindless descent by stepping to the other side of my vehicle. I don't know what made me think the car would start if I tried again, but despite my former failures, I awkwardly jumped inside and turned the key. My eyes widened with joy when the engine turned over, followed by the familiar rumbling of the vehicle running. I threw the shifter into drive and slammed my foot on the gas without hesitation and sped off into the dark. I thought I was in the clear, and my breathing slowly returned to normal. It was odd that some strange part of me thought that maybe it was just a ghost that was asking for help, but that was highly improbable, and now I know that wasn't the case. The freeway was still obscured by the all-encompassing darkness, but I didn't care. I just kept driving. Then my heart skipped a beat because standing on the side of the road was a headless person. I drove by but couldn't see them in my rearview mirror due to the darkness. I took a breath and drove on without trying to think about it too much, taking a look at my clock to see what time it was. It read 0 o'clock. Great, I said aloud, still maintaining a relatively high speed. My hands were firmly gripping the steering wheel, and I kept thinking it was over. But I was wrong again. Like before, I saw the body standing adjacent to the freeway with an outstretched thumb. It started walking into the road as if it were trying to be hit. I avoided it and continued on, completely freaked out. I took a peek in my rearview mirror, and I could have sworn it was sitting in my back seat. But as I quickly glanced over my shoulder, it was just an empty seat. My paranoia was somewhat satiated when I saw it again, but now it was holding something in the hand that didn't have its thumb out. As I drove by, I narrowed my eyes to see it closer. It was holding a smiling head. At this point, I was close to the fainting from the fear. I just wanted this horror looped, but as the thought crossed my mind, I heard something heavy fall onto the roof of my car. I jumped in my seat, startled by the sound, and looked up. Obviously, I couldn't see anything, but I could hear movement, and I could sense the weight lurking above. Regrettably, during all the chaos, I had still forgotten to roll the window up, which I admit was entirely my fault. Much to my dismay. I say that because the sound suddenly stopped and I thought it was over once again. But when I looked to my left, I was met face to face with the severed head. The body was on the roof, holding the head in my open window. I yelled, and it tossed the head inside, and it latched onto my thigh, biting deeply into my muscle. It laughed maniacally, and I nearly crashed trying to deal with both the head and keeping my vehicle on the road. I yelled out in pain and began pounding my fist against the back of the head. Luckily, one of my attacks dislodged it from my leg, and I grabbed onto it with my free hand before throwing it out of the window. All at once the darkness lifted, and I was able to see the head bouncing down the freeway in my mirror, followed by the body it belonged to sliding off my roof, only to tumble on the road. I was breathing so hard I thought I might lose consciousness, and my leg was bleeding pretty badly, but I dared not stop. I started to see other vehicles, and that's when I finally allowed myself to feel any sort of relief. The events I had experienced shocked my system, and I decided I would pull off at the nearest town and get a motel for the rest of the night. When I found one, the lady at the counter said, "Your face is so pale. Are you okay?" I looked deeply into her eyes and said, "There was a man, or rather, a body on the freeway without a head. It terrorized me and nearly killed me." She stared at me for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Oh, you young people, you always have the craziest stories. Although I do seem to remember someone else saying something about a body on the freeway once." My eyes lit up. "What did they say? What happened to them?" "Well, nothing happened. We called the police, but they found no bodies, nor did they find any evidence of an accident. The person ended up leaving the next morning, and that was that." I uttered softly. I got a room for the night and addressed my wound. It wasn't as bad as I originally thought. It must have been the lighting that made it look worse. I stayed until around early morning, and then checked out with barely any sleep. Now I'm telling you to avoid driving down any freeway if you're going to Texas. I mean, I can't say for sure what the catalyst is, but something to do with my specific trip caused me to experience this horrific anomaly, and I just want to warn everyone I can. Although the lady at the counter did say someone else experienced something similar, I just don't know, and it's better to be safe than sorry. What's even worse is that when I was about to get into my car to continue my drive south, I noticed a fresh handprint pressed firmly against the outside of my driver's window. I guess I'll be sticking to day driving from now on. Story 2. I don't drive at night anymore. Sometimes your eyes play tricks on you when it's dark. At least that's what I told myself the first time I saw one of them. I had been in my hometown this week visiting my parents, and I got a text from an old friend. "Hey Jay, I know you're busy, man," it read, "but Cam is home too, and I thought we could order some food and watch the game." I have never been big on sports, but I hadn't seen Will in well over a year, and Cam in even longer. On the way out the door, my mom told me to be safe, text her, and I get there, all the usual. Will lives pretty far back into the woods, and it took me a while to get there. After being chastised a bit for being late, we threw a pizza in the oven and sat down. We spent more time talking about what we'd been up to than watching the game, which was fine by me. Time always flies among good company, and before I knew it, it was well after midnight. James just stayed, dude. I already cleaned the futon. First of all, I've slept enough nights on that futon to know how bad my back will hurt in the morning. Second, I promised my parents I'd make them breakfast in the morning. After a little more complaining from them, we finally said our goodbyes and made the yearly promise that we will really keep in touch this time. Seeing that it was very late and there were no street lights for miles, I threw on my high beams and started making my way home. I always have a bit of an uneasy feeling driving dark roads at night, so I opened my phone to put on some music. After 30 seconds of buffering, I remembered how horrible my service was out here and turned off my phone. It was shortly after that when I saw it. In my peripheral vision, I swore I saw a person standing a few yards off the side of the road. A quick glance at my rearview mirror showed nothing of interest and put my mind at ease. Sometimes your eyes play tricks on you when it's dark. I should really start wearing my glasses when I drive. The moment I finished scolding myself, it happened again. A person standing perfectly still on the side of the road. I only caught a glimpse, but this time I was positive I wasn't seeing things. Another look at my mirrors yielded the same result as before, but I knew what I saw. Instinctually I stepped on the gas a little. I knew these roads like the back of my hand, and I could afford to speed for my peace of mind. Unfortunately, all the peace of mind in the world could not have prepared me for what I saw next. My driver's side mirror exploded as the face of a small girl flew past my window. I slammed on my brakes before I could think. My heart was beating out of my chest as I came to grips with what had just happened. Where had she come from? I may not be the most blessed visually, but I knew that there was nobody in the road for me to have hit. As stupid as it may sound, I stepped out of my car to check on the girl. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I committed a hit and run. My stomach did a flip when I looked up to see nothing. No little girl, no remnants of my mirror, not even fallen twigs or leaves. The road was bare. Thoroughly scared at this point, I scrambled back into my car and shut the door, barely noticing that my mirror was back in its place and skay. That was until I saw a white spot in the corner of my vision. I looked into my newly returned mirror to see two pale figures in plain clothes standing in the tree line maybe 30 feet behind my car. They didn't seem to move. I couldn't make out details in the low light, but I could feel their gazes fixed on me, burning holes through me. I lost control of my body as I felt my foot try to push the gas pedal through the floor. I had never understood how intense true fight or flight is until that moment. I stole another glance at my mirror, and yet again the figures had disappeared. There was a lull, and I took a moment to breathe and get my bearings. I saw a small country billboard that I knew was about halfway between my parents' house and Will's. It had a small light on top to make the advertisement visible at all hours. This brought me a brief moment of comfort that was quickly shattered when I saw what looked like a pair of bare feet below the sign. As I drove past, I turned around and, to my horror, there was a man, backlit by the dim glow of the sign. This man was unnaturally tall and gaunt. His facial features were hidden to me, but like before I could feel. Whatever it was staring daggers into my soul. My knuckles turned white, and I thought I might snap the steering wheel in half from how hard I was gripping it. I told myself that no matter what, I would not look in my mirrors again before I made it home. My foot still pressed firmly to the floor. I concentrated on the dark and marked pavement. It took all my willpower not to look at the things I saw in the corners of my vision. I was so focused on avoiding my mirrors that it took me almost half a minute to notice the bright red and blue glow that filled them. Realizing what I was seeing, I was brought back down to earth. As much as it pained me, I pulled over into the shallow ditch that lined the road. A shout filled the air as I rolled down my window. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Before I could answer, the officer spoke again, more concerned than angry this time. "James, Christ alive, son. Are you trying to kill someone? Why are you driving like a goddamn maniac?" Officer Wilcox was a good friend of my father. Those two used to spend nights in our den, drinking and discussing what new gun they bought that week. I thanked God that he was the one to pull me over. "Sir, I am so sorry. What was I going to tell him? That I hit a little girl with my car and ran because I saw something scary in the dark? He would think I'm a fucking lunatic. I was being chased. A car without their lights on was following me until probably a mile back. I know I should have called it in. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Not very believable, but the best I could come up with. Jesus, kid, I don't even know what to say to that. "Have you has anything to drink or taken anything tonight?" "No, sir. A lie. I'd had 2 beers a few hours prior. I really am sorry. I was just so scared and didn't know what to do." "All right. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and let you off with a warning." I breathed a sigh of relief before he finished. "On the condition that tomorrow to come to the station and make a written statement about the incident. Lying to a family friend was one thing, but lying under oath was another thing entirely." I thought for a moment before agreeing to his terms. It was stupid, but it was the choice that got me off this godforsaken road and behind the locked doors of my parents' house the fastest. He told me that he would drive back the way I came and look for anything suspicious and set me on my way. All of my anxiety flooded back as he shut his lights off and disappeared from view. Despite that, I also knew that he would be the only officer on duty, and I wouldn't have to worry about my speed for the rest of the drive. I put my foot back to the floor, flying through intersections that I knew would be empty and catching air a few times over the small hills that dotted the road. My car was taking a beating, but I had to get home. I don't know if it was because I was so hyper-focused on the road, or if there was truly nothing to see for the rest of the ride home, but by the time I reached my driveway I had not seen another one of the figures. That realization did not help with the massive pit that the thought of walking to my front door created in my stomach. I had never been more afraid than at that moment. Eventually I psyched myself up enough to make a break for it. I opened my door and ran as fast as I could onto the front porch. While I fumbled to find my house key, I looked over my shoulder out of habit. As far as I could tell, there was nothing to be seen. The neighborhood was as it usually was at this hour, quiet and deserted. As I turned back around, I felt all the air leave my body. In the reflection of the storm door, I saw the pale hands on my shoulders and a twisted face towering over my head. I woke up in the back of an ambulance, screaming. My mother had found me unconscious on the porch, bleeding from a gash where I had hit my head on the way down. Nobody believes me when I try to explain what happened. I write this as Officer Wilcox and a quiet man in a suit sit and wait for me to finish. I don't know what they were, but I know that they were real, and I know that I don't drive at night anymore. My thoughts exactly time to friggin' leave. I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later, we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. "I think we're in the clear." Man, Craig let out a soft laugh. "Thank fuck for that," I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let a laugh of my own. "I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this, I may take a bit of a break from late night drives for a bit. This just got under my skin too much for a few moments, longer than I thought. There was nothing." And then he answered, "As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all." Story 3. If you're driving at night, don't stop for any hitchhikers. I've always hated driving at night. It always felt unsafe, like something could just jump out at me at any moment. But after what happened to me a couple of years ago, I'm terrified of it. I was driving through an abandoned country road somewhere in West Virginia at around 2 a.m. I had been driving for hours. All I wanted to do was go to sleep, but there were no motels in sight. I noticed a lean, tall man with brown hair standing at the side of the road. His clothes were old and tattered. He appeared to be hitchhiking. I ignored him at first, but it was as if something was compelling me to let him in. I approached him and slowed down. He noticed me. I asked him if he needed a ride. He nodded. I let him in. I wish I never had. So I said, "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere." There was something off about the way he spoke. He didn't have an accent or anything. It's just that his voice was so generic. It sounded automated, like something you'd hear in a text-to-speech program. The cryptic answer he gave unsettled me. "Anywhere? What the hell did he even mean by that? I'm as sorry, I said anywhere. His voice had become firmer, more commanding. Something about it compelled me to just keep driving further and further. Before I knew it, I was surrounded by total darkness. My car had broken down. I couldn't move. I began hyperventilating, a cold sweat running down my back. Dark figures were circling the car. Some pressed their shadowy hands against the windows. Others scratched the car. There were even some faint whispers. I felt as if I was about to pass out. This couldn't be happening. I tried desperately to close my eyes, to get away from whatever the hell was going on. But I was paralyzed. More figures began looking through the windows, looking right at me. I looked right back at them, unable to look anywhere else, forced to. My breathing became heavier, more panicked. The figures were scratching the windows persistently. I don't know how much time passed, but every second felt like an eternity. The scratching became louder and louder. Some of the figures were banging on the windows. The whispers had become growls. One of the windows shattered. The last thing I saw before blacking out was a shadowy arm reaching out to me. I woke up in a clean, white room, lying on a soft bed. A woman in a long, white coat was next to me. "You're finally awake," she said. "WH, what happened?" I asked. "Your car was found flipped over on the side of a road. Frankly, it's a miracle you're alive." I was to relieve, to be shocked. At least now I was alive, safe from those things. I suddenly remembered the man I had picked up. Oh, God, was he safe? Had those things hurt him? What about the other man in my car? She looked at me with an expression of confusion. "There wasn't anyone else in your car," she said. I was too stunned to respond. Had it all been a hallucination? It seemed like the least terrifying explanation. I accepted it for the sake of my sanity. After a long stay at the hospital, I finally went home. I moved on with my life, never telling anyone about what I saw that night. But even now, on dark nights like that one, I still see shadowy figures reaching out to me in the corner of my eye. Story 4. Night driving. A friend of mine told me this story about a girl she met from Sweden who was staying with her as a couch surfer. The girl was in her mid-20s, and while my friend told me her name, I never remembered it. Just the content of this horrific story that will never leave my mind. So this girl, let's call her Jane, was driving to her mother's house. They lived far out of the city and in a highly forested area. There were no street lights and not a lot of houses. If there were houses, they were built back into the forest with long winding driveways before any sight of life. So Jane was a late teenager driving back to her mother's home in the late evening. As she was driving, something up ahead on the road caught her eye. It was a small bundle next to the road, and as her car passed the bundle, she was shocked. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. Jane smashed the brake, stopping 50 meters up the road. She revered back a little and then jumped out of the car as quick as she could, thinking that someone had abandoned a baby on the road. Jane ran over to the bundled-up blanket and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was just a toy baby. Just as she had picked up the baby, she saw headlights coming down the road in front of her. Suddenly realizing she was standing on the road alone at night, she ran quickly back to her car and jumped in, chucking on the engine and driving off. The car behind her sped up, coming up really close to the back of her cart, tooting its horn at her. Jane was panicking. She started driving faster and faster, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Although she couldn't who was in the car behind her, she was still terrified. Eventually she reached her mother's driveway, which was still about 2 kilometers long. Her mother lived deep into the forest. She thought to herself that if the car followed her down the driveway, she would call her mother and tell her to ring the police. And as she turned onto the driveway, the car behind her also turned into the driveway, still very close behind her. I remember part of the story was that she kept thinking back to the baby toe and how creepy the evening had been. Jane got out her phone and called her mother. She told her she was being followed and to call the police. She was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. The car was still following very close, and both cars were going way too fast for the type of road and for no street lights. Jane could see nothing but what was being lit by her headlights and the headlights of her pursuer. Then she saw her mother's house in the distance of her headlights, the pursuers still very close behind her, still beeping the horn so loudly Jane's ears rang. As she got to the house, she jumped out of the car. Her mother was standing at the front of the house waiting for her with a kitchen knife in her hand. Jane ran up to her as quickly as she could. The car that was following also stopped, and the doors of the car flew open. An elderly couple jumped out of the car and were yelling and pointing to Jane's car. "Someone got into your car," they screamed. As Jane was realizing what had happened, a man jumped out of the back seat of Jane's car and ran into the forest. Everyone just looked at each other in shock as Jane realized what had just happened. The car coming down the road had seen someone jump into her car when she stopped to check the baby. It was most likely they had left it there on the road watching for people to stop, taking advantage of people's kindness. As I said at the start of this post, a friend of mine told me this story, and I believe it to be true. If anyone else has heard of this, send a comment. I don't believe it was the guy's first time trying this. Always lock your doors when you get out of your car. Story 5. Don't stop driving late at night. It all started late last night. About once a month I visit my parents for the weekend, who live about 4 hours away from me. It is a quiet, peaceful drive through remote rural roads, so I don't mind how often I drive them. Last night the drive was like many others, with the only exception being that I left later than usual. It was dark for the majority of the drive, and I didn't return home until almost midnight. That being said, it was a nice drive, although I could see lightning flashing in the distance from a far-off storm that I seemed to be following. About 2 hours in, on the most remote section, I thought I saw something in the distance. I am always afraid of deer or moose, so I tend to slow right down at the slightest sign of life. As I approached, I was shocked to see what appeared to be a person lying on the side of the road. I slammed the car to a stop and ran out to see if they were all right. As I drew close, I could clearly see it was a girl who appeared to be in her 20s, with dark black hair and torn, muddy clothing. I called out to her, "Are you okay?" There was no answer or sign of movement. I quickly crouched down and put my fingers to her neck as I had seen on TV, trying to check for some signs of vitals. Nothing. I grabbed her wrists, trying for a different pulse, and was shocked at how cold her skin felt. With a sinking feeling, I knew I was too late. Her face was turned away at an odd angle, and so I gently reached out and turned it towards me, and knew for sure she was gone as soon as I saw her eyes. They stared back at me, and blinking. For a moment it appeared as though a flash of sentience still shone in them, but it quickly faded, leaving dull, glassy eyes staring at me through the darkness. I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911. I briefly hesitated, Do I still call 911 when the person is already dead? Do I call the local police phone number instead? Technically, it's not an emergency anymore. Shaking my head at myself, I dialed 911. Police, fire, or ambulance? The reassuring voice said on the other end, police or ambulance. I'm not sure. What is the emergency? She inquired. Well, I was out driving, and there is a girl at the side of the road, but I think she's already dead. She has no pulse, her skin is cold, and she is unresponsive. I spoke quickly, almost stumbling over my words, as I was understandably feeling a little unnerved. I quickly gave the operator my location and pertinent details. Police and ambulance are on their way. Are there any signs of injury on her? The woman asked. I quickly checked. No, she is only muddy, and her clothing is torn, I replied. It took me aback, as I hadn't realized until that moment how strange it was that a girl should be out here in the middle of nowhere, dead with no signs of injury. As I looked around at the darkness, I began to feel nervous and decided to wait in my car. Still speaking with the operator, the police showed up fairly quickly, and the officers asked me a few short questions before I was allowed to continue on my journey. As I continued driving, I tried to shake off the events of the night, but as I was driving through darkness, with no means to distract myself, I understandably found it hard to forget. I finally arrived home, ready to go straight to bed. A little embarrassed, I left the hallway light on outside my door. It may seem silly, but it was my first experience even seeing a dead body, and I was feeling a little creeped out. Normally my roommates would help me feel secure, but both were gone at the moment, and the apartment felt strange and empty without them. I fell asleep fairly quickly, but suddenly woke up around 2:30 a.m. It took me a second to realize why everything felt wrong. The hallway light, which I had purposefully left on to shine some light in the room, was out. As I realized this, I felt a chill take over my body as I lay in the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Slowly, I began to see shapes in the darkness and reassured myself that everything was okay. I saw my desk take shape and my dresser. My yoga mat rolled into a ball gave me a fright until I realized what it was. However, I slowly came to realize that there was one shape I couldn't place. In the middle of the room was a dark, humped shape, taking up the center of the floor. I racked my brain as my body froze in fear and my heart pounded, trying to think what it was I could have left there. It was only as I saw the glimmers in it that I realized it was exactly the shape of the girl last night, and the curled-up position she had been left in on the side of the road, and the glimmers were exactly where her eyes would have been.